'Cause you're hot, then you're cold, you're yes, then you're no, you're in, then you're out, you're up, then you're down. Do you like change? Some people might, but personally, I don't really like change. Don't like it when it gets too hot or too cold. And guess what? Neither does your body. You see, when the outside temperature becomes too hot or too cold, the body has a way of regulating and keeping a relatively constant body temperature. And keeping things constant in the face of changing surroundings. This has a term. There's a word to describe this. And that's the name of our next topic. Homeostasis. Homeostasis refers to your body's ability to keep a relatively constant internal environment in the face of changing surroundings. And this chapter is going to be really exciting. You can learn about why we sweat, why we shiver, and how your body keeps you constant in the face of ever-changing surroundings. So let's get going. I hope you're excited. So we're going to start off by just defining what is homeostasis and understanding why it is important. Your textbook pages are as follows. So how many of you know someone who keeps fish? Well, I just came back from a friend's place and he had a fish tank and he introduced me to his fish tank, and he also showed me some devices that were connected to his fish tank. And I asked him, what are these devices for? And he told me they are to keep the conditions of the water in the fish tank constant. I asked him why. He said, yeah, because if the conditions change, the fish will probably die. So as a start to this chapter on homeostasis, I want you to think about what are some of the conditions of the fish tank fluid, the water, that need to be kept constant so that the fish will survive. Have a brainstorm about that and pause the video for a while and play again when you're ready to move on. So what do you think of? Let's see whether you got some of these answers. The salt concentration. Right, some fish can endure high levels of salt and some just can't, so we need to keep that relatively constant. Then we need to make sure the fish have sufficient nutrients in the fluid that surrounds them. And the pH, right? Some fish perhaps can't tolerate high or low pH. So that needs to be constant as well. And then of course the oxygen and carbon dioxide concentration. Right? We need to constantly supply oxygen into the fluid and remove carbon dioxide from it. And of course the waste levels. Fish produce waste, obviously, and that needs to be removed from the tank as well. We need to keep waste levels low and at that constant low level so that the fish will survive. So what does this fish tank have to do with homeostasis in our body? Well, it turns out that you can think of our body as a fish tank. And just like the fish tank contains many fish, so our body contains many cells. Right, so the fish are like the cells in our body. Right? The fish tank is our body, and the fish are like the cells in the body. And just like the fish are surrounded by fish tank fluid, the cells in our body are surrounded by tissue fluid or blood plasma. Right? Your tissue cells are surrounded by tissue fluid. Your blood cells are surrounded by the plasma. And just as it is important, it's important to keep the conditions of the fish tank fluid constant. It is also important that we keep the conditions of the tissue fluid and the blood plasma relatively constant. Because the cells are surrounded by the tissue fluid. If the conditions of the tissue fluid change, it will affect the survival of the cells. So what is homeostasis? Well, homeostasis is the maintenance of a relatively constant internal environment. In the case of our body, the internal environment refers to the composition of the tissue fluid and our blood, right? Specifically the blood plasma. So homeostasis means maintaining the composition of tissue fluid and blood within narrow limits. For example, the salt concentration or the water potential of the tissue fluid. Homeostasis means keeping the water potential of the tissue fluid within a certain range. So it shouldn't go too high, neither should it go too low. Otherwise, it will affect the survival of our body's cells. Similarly, we want to keep the nutrient levels in the tissue fluid within narrow limits. We want to keep the pH of the tissue fluid within narrow limits. The oxygen and the carbon dioxide concentration, keep it within narrow limits. And the waste levels, keep it within narrow limits as well. It shouldn't go too high or too low. So that's what homeostasis is. Keeping things constant or relatively constant in the body. Now, another example is body temperature, right? Our body maintains a relatively constant internal temperature. But I would like to ask you a question. I mean, you all learn in primary school that our body has a temperature of around 37 degrees. However, is it more accurate to say that the body maintains a constant temperature of 37 degrees, or that the body maintains a temperature within a narrow limit? What do you think? Which is more accurate? Think about it, pause the video, and continue when you're ready to find out. Alright, so what do you think? Well, think about yourself when you go for a temperature taking exercise, alright? Now, when you measure your temperature, do you measure 37 degrees all the time? Not really, right? Sometimes the temperature will fluctuate up and down. And that's exactly what happens. If you measure the body temperature across a 24-hour day, from 0 to 24 hours, you'll notice that the temperature isn't constantly at 37 degrees. Rather, it fluctuates around a certain range or around a certain set point in the middle of that range. So in this case, it's more accurate to say that homeostasis maintains the temperature within narrow limits. Right? It doesn't maintain it at a constant 37 degrees, but rather within narrow limits around a certain set point that is in the middle of that range. So why is homeostasis important anyway? Well, it allows us, organisms, to survive in spite of changes in our external environment. So even though the temperature around me changes very high or very low, I'm still able to survive because I'm able to regulate my own body temperature at a relatively constant temperature. And it's the same way these penguins, right, they're able to survive, very cute, right? They're able to survive even though there are many extreme changes in temperature around them, because they're able to maintain a constant, relatively constant body temperature. Now let's try linking what we know here with what we learned in previous chapters. So why is it so important that our body temperature and the pH of our tissue fluids and blood is kept relatively constant? Here's a little hint. What do you think? Pause and think for a while. Now hopefully you identified that this diagram here shows an enzyme and its substrate. And hopefully you remember that enzymes' activities are affected by temperature and pH. So what happens if our body temperature and pH changes too drastically? Well, it might end up causing our enzymes to be denatured and hence to not be able to function anymore. So when certain enzyme reactions and biological reactions can't take place in your body anymore, it will affect the survival of your cells and therefore your survival as well. Now, how about the water potential of the tissue fluid? Why is it important to keep that constant? Now, here are two pictures to give you a hint to the answer for this question. Think about it. So hopefully you remember that if the water potential of the tissue fluid changes too much, it might either cause your cells to shrivel, shrink, or to swell and to burst due to the movement of water in or out of the cell by osmosis. Okay, so we've defined homeostasis. It is maintaining a relatively constant internal environment. And we've seen that this internal environment in our body is made up of the tissue fluid and the blood that surrounds our cells. And we've seen that homeostasis is important to ensure the survival of our cells and the proper functioning of enzymes. So in the next video, we're going to explore a bit more about how homeostasis works. So I'll see you there.